March 14, 1879, 3 farmers in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, were preparing their fields when a sound froze them in place. From beneath the soil came muffled screaming, desperate and human. Following the cries, they found a patch of disturbed ground near an old farmhouse, and there, a man's hand clawing up through the dirt. What they dug out was barely alive, eyes wild, mouth gasping for air. His name was Silas Cunningham, a farmer who had vanished 3 days earlier. When he finally spoke, his story revealed a family secret so disturbing that the court sealed it for decades. Part 1: The Silence Before the Storm, 900 words. Before we begin, if you're watching from Pennsylvania, or anywhere these forgotten American tragedies took place, leave a comment telling me your state. And hit that subscribe button, because this story will make you question what isolation and bloodlines can do to the human soul. The story of the Cunningham family didn't start with violence. It began with silence, the kind that lingers in lonely valleys where secrets grow like roots beneath the ground. Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, in 1879, was a hard land. Endless forests of pine and oak covered the Allegheny Plateau, broken by rough farms and coal mining camps. Around 20,000 people lived scattered across 900 square miles, loggers, miners, and farmers trying to survive the brutal winters. Roads turned to mud in spring and froze solid in winter, and some families could go weeks without seeing another human soul. The Cunningham homestead sat in the far northwest of the county, on a narrow wagon road between Osceola Mills and Phillipsburg. The farm was 80 acres of stubborn earth, rocky, hilly, and poor. The house itself was old, built sometime in the 1820s. Its dark wooden boards had weathered almost black, and the porch sagged like tired shoulders. Behind it, a root cellar sank into the hill, and beyond that, only forest. Silas Cunningham, the man buried alive, was 57 that spring. Hard years had bent him, his hands twisted with arthritis, his back curved from decades of labor. He was a small man, lean and weary-looking, with streaks of gray in his long hair and beard. His clothes were patched and stained, his boots repaired with scraps of animal hide. But it wasn't Silas himself who frightened people, it was his sons. 3 of them, Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah. Locals said they were strange, that they kept to themselves, that travelers passing by the farm sometimes saw them watching from the fields. People crossed themselves when the Cunningham name came up. The oldest, Josiah, was 31. Tall but hunched, with a head shaped too long, a jaw that sloped away, and pale eyes that never quite met another's. His hands were large, red, and swollen, fingers that seemed unable to straighten. When he spoke, his words came out thick and slow, as though his tongue were too big for his mouth. The middle son, Caleb, was 28, broad and powerful from farm work. His face looked uneven, one eye higher than the other, ears turned out oddly. He had a habit of rocking on his feet, back and forth, like a pendulum. His speech was rough but understandable. The youngest, Nehemiah, was 24. He was short, but his body was all muscle, and his face bore the most obvious signs of deformity, an underbite, wide nose, and small, uneven ears. But Nehemiah's eyes were different. Sharp, intelligent, calculating. He was the one who did the talking when the family had to deal with outsiders. Locals whispered about the Cunninghams for years. The truth was buried generations deep. Silas's grandfather, Ezra Cunningham, had bought the land in the 1820s. He came from the east with a wife and 2 children. But his wife died their first winter, and Ezra raised the children, a son named Josiah and a daughter named Rebecca, alone in that house. Then came the whispers. Ezra never remarried. Rebecca never left. And when Josiah the elder grew up, he didn't leave either. Parish records show one strange marriage in 1832, between Josiah Cunningham and Rebecca Cunningham. The priest had written their names, but not the fact that they were brother and sister. From that union came Silas. 2 siblings who didn't survive infancy, and 1 son who grew to carry both the burden and the curse of that bloodline. Silas later married Martha Yoder, daughter of German settlers from the next county. They had 3 sons, Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah. Martha died young, in 1858, her cause of death listed only as wasting illness. After that, Silas raised the boys alone, shut off from the world. The boys rarely saw anyone outside their own family. They didn't go to school. They didn't attend church. They learned only what their father could teach them, which wasn't much. By the 1870s, the Cunninghams had become local legend. Travelers claimed to hear strange chants from the woods near their farm. Others said they saw fires at night, or animal bones hanging from trees. Maybe those were just stories. But they kept people away. The Hofmeister family, 2 miles south, were the closest neighbors. Wilhelm Hofmeister said he tried to help, offering tools, labor, food, but Silas always refused, his voice flat, his eyes cold. Then came the winter of 1878 to 1879, one of the harshest on record. Snow started in November and buried the roads until March. The Cunninghams' livestock froze in their pens. Food ran low. The woods were silent, and inside that small farmhouse, 4 men, father and 3 sons, sat through the long dark, waiting for spring. No one knows exactly what happened in those final days before March 14. But the sheriff's later report said the arguments began about food. Silas accused his sons of stealing from the stores. The brothers turned on each other. Voices were heard from the road one night, distant shouts carried by the wind. Then silence again. For 3 days, no one saw movement at the Cunningham farm. Then, on March 14, those 3 farmers found Silas clawing his way up through the soil. When they pulled him out, he was barely alive. His fingernails torn away, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes wild. He couldn't speak at first. But when he finally did, his words made the sheriff's face turn pale. He said his own sons had buried him alive. And what he told them next, about why, would reveal the most horrifying secret Clearfield County had ever heard. To be continued in Part 2, The Sons of Silence. Would you like me to continue with Part 2, The Sons of Silence, in the same tone, simple, eerie, and cinematic for YouTube narration 1000 words? Title: The Sons Who Buried Their Father Alive, Part 2, The Cunningham Family Horror 1879. When rescuers dug Silas Cunningham from the frozen ground of Clearfield County, Pennsylvania, they expected to find a dead man. Instead, he was alive, barely. His hands were torn from clawing at the earth, his lips cracked from thirst, his eyes filled with terror. But what chilled the rescuers most was not what they found, it was what Silas said. He whispered that his own sons had buried him alive. What could drive 3 brothers to such madness? What happened inside that lonely farmhouse during the winter of 1879 would soon reveal a nightmare born from years of silence, control, and bloodline secrets. Part 2, The Night of the Burial, 900 words. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was one of the harshest in Pennsylvania's history. Snow came early, heavy, and endless. Roads vanished beneath white drifts. Wagons froze in place. Entire valleys were cut off for weeks at a time. The Cunningham farm, already isolated, became a prison. Their supplies, never abundant, ran low before January was half over. By February, the pigs were dead, the chickens eaten, and even the last jar of preserves gone. What remained was cornmeal, a little salt pork, and water from a half-frozen creek. Inside the old farmhouse, 4 men, Silas and his 3 sons, sat through the darkness. No visitors, no sound but the wind and the creak of the old boards. For months they had barely spoken. Meals passed in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. The air itself seemed heavy with resentment. By March, the quiet turned dangerous. According to Silas's later testimony, the breaking point came on March 11, 1879. That morning, Caleb, the middle son, complained his portion of food was too small. Silas, already irritable from hunger, snapped at him. He reminded his sons that he was still the head of the family, that he alone decided how their food was rationed. Caleb's face darkened. He slammed his bowl down and stood, trembling with rage. "You take the most for yourself," he shouted. "You starve us while you sit fat by the fire." Silas struck him, hard across the face. It wasn't the first time. But this time, Caleb didn't back down. Josiah, the oldest, rose slowly from his chair. He didn't speak much, but his loyalty to his brothers was unquestionable. Nehemiah, the youngest and the cleverest, leaned forward from the shadows near the hearth. His voice was calm when he spoke, almost too calm. "Father," he said, "you've punished us long enough." The argument grew violent. Years of bitterness poured out. The sons accused Silas of beating them since childhood, of keeping them prisoners on the farm, of stealing their chance at normal lives. They said he'd hidden them away because of shame, the shame of their family's bloodline. Silas shouted that he had only protected them. That outsiders wouldn't understand. That if the truth came out, the incest that had started with his own parents, they'd all be cast out or locked away. But the more he spoke, the more his sons saw him not as a protector, but as their jailer. The shouting lasted for hours. When Silas finally tried to retreat to his bedroom, Josiah blocked the stairs. Caleb moved to his side. And Nehemiah watched, eyes bright, calculating. Silas tried to push past them, but the brothers grabbed him. What happened next was chaos, a struggle of limbs and shouts echoing through the old house. 3 strong men against one older, weaker father. They shoved him out the front door, into the freezing night. The wind bit at his skin. Snowflakes caught in his hair. He pounded on the door, begging to be let back in. But his sons didn't answer. Through the frosted window, he could see their shapes moving inside, conferring in low voices. Then the door opened. Nehemiah stood there holding a shovel. Caleb carried rope. Josiah brought a canvas tarpaulin. "Come with us," Nehemiah said simply. Too cold and frightened to resist, Silas followed them around the back of the house, past the root cellar to a patch of softer ground where the snow had melted. The brothers began to dig. The rhythm of the shovels was slow and steady. At first, Silas thought they were digging for a grave, his grave. He waited for the blow that would end his life. But as the hole grew deeper, a more terrible realization dawned. They weren't planning to kill him first. They were going to bury him alive. Silas screamed, begged, pleaded. He promised to change, to share control of the farm, to forgive whatever they thought he'd done. But the brothers kept digging, their faces blank, determined. When the pit reached 4 feet deep, Nehemiah climbed down and ordered his father to step inside. Silas resisted until Caleb shoved him backward, and he fell hard into the cold, damp earth. Nehemiah unrolled the tarpaulin and draped it loosely over him, not for comfort, but for cruelty. It would keep him alive longer, letting him breathe while the dirt pressed down. Before they began to cover the pit, Nehemiah crouched beside the edge and spoke softly. "You buried us, Father. You buried our lives, our futures, everything we could have been. Now you'll feel it. You'll know what it's like to live under the earth, trapped, waiting for the dark to take you." Then came the first shovelful of dirt. Silas felt it strike the canvas above his chest. More followed, heavy and cold. He screamed until his throat tore, but the sound was muffled by snow and soil. The brothers worked slowly, methodically, making sure the air pocket remained near his face. They wanted him to feel the full weight of it, to live long enough to understand. When the grave was filled, they packed the top smooth and even, as though nothing had disturbed it. Then they stood together in silence, listening. From below came faint scratching. A muffled moan, then nothing. They turned and walked back to the house. Inside, they ate supper as if it were any other night. They sat by the fire, cleaned their dishes, and went to bed. Not one word about their father. Not one glance toward the window where the lamplight could still reach the yard. Outside, 4 feet below the frozen ground, Silas Cunningham lay awake. The tarpaulin clung to his face, damp with his breath. The air grew thinner. The cold seeped into his bones. Every time he tried to move, dirt shifted down and tightened around him. He prayed. He screamed. He scratched until his nails tore. And in that silent Pennsylvania night, the earth began to claim him, slowly, cruelly, deliberately. But fate wasn't finished with Silas Cunningham yet. To be continued in Part 3, The Man Who Crawled from the Earth. Would you like me to write Part 3 next? The chapter where Silas claws his way out and the horrifying aftermath unfolds, in the same cinematic, simple style for YouTube narration. Title: The Buried Secret of the Cunningham Farm, Part 3. A historical horror story, written in simple English for American audiences. The earth pressed down like a living thing. Beneath it, Silas Cunningham struggled to breathe. The weight crushed his chest, the soil filled his mouth, and panic clawed at his mind. He tried to scream, but the ground swallowed every sound. Above him, there was only silence. His 3 sons had done what no sons should ever do. They had buried their father alive. But how did it come to this? How could a family twist so far from love into madness? To understand that terrible night in March 1879, we must return decades earlier, to the roots of the Cunningham curse. Part 3: The Cursed Bloodline. The Cunningham family's story began long before Silas took his first breath. It started with his parents, Josiah and Rebecca, brother and sister. Whether out of isolation or the strange belief that their blood should remain pure, their union produced something broken. Silas was born from that darkness. He was a quiet child, slow to learn, and often stared for hours at things no one else could see. He could plow a field but couldn't solve a simple problem. People in Osceola Mills whispered that something wasn't right in the Cunningham bloodline. By the time Silas turned 20, his father was dead, and the farm was his to manage. The land began to rot just as the family had. Fences broke, crops failed, animals wandered off. Silas wandered too, lost in his own mind, unable to keep the world in order. Then came Martha Yoder. Her father owned the general store in town, and, when debts piled up, he offered his daughter to Silas as part of the payment. In 1845, they married, not for love, but for survival. Martha was 19, Silas was 23. She soon discovered she had married a man who was more child than husband. He talked to himself at night, disappeared into the woods for days, and came back with mud-caked hands and wild eyes. In letters to her sister, Martha described the house as a prison. She wrote of long winters where the snow buried them alive and of nights filled with strange noises coming from the woods. Then came the children. Josiah was born first, in 1848. Caleb followed in 1851, then Nehemiah in 1855. Each child was different, each one more unusual than the last. Their eyes were too far apart, their speech slow, their tempers violent. Martha begged Silas to let a doctor examine them, but he refused. "We don't need outsiders," he said. "We take care of our own." By 1858, Martha's letters turned desperate. She wrote of fear, of secrets she had uncovered about Silas's family, things that explain much but make everything worse, she said. No one ever learned what she meant. A month later, she was dead. The doctor called it pneumonia, but her thin body told another story. Bruises marked her arms and throat. She looked starved, hollow. But no one in rural Pennsylvania asked too many questions, not about a lonely farm miles from town. After her death, something inside the house broke. Silas grew more withdrawn. The boys ran wild, half feral. No schooling, no church, no neighbors. They lived only for the farm and each other. Josiah, the oldest, stayed quiet and simple-minded. Caleb had a temper that frightened even his brothers. Nehemiah, the youngest, was the smartest, and the most dangerous. He watched everything. He learned how to control the others with just a look or a word. By the time they were grown men, they barely spoke English, mixing strange words and hand gestures that only they understood. People said they were like animals who had forgotten how to be human. One summer, a neighboring farmer named Wilhelm Hofmeister tried to speak to them while they worked near the property line. The boys said nothing. They just stared, silent, blank-faced, their eyes unblinking. Hofmeister told the sheriff later that he had never seen anything so unnerving. "They looked at me like wolves deciding if I was worth killing," he said. Years passed, and the farm grew worse. The animals died off. The fields turned to weeds. By the winter of 1878, Silas was 60 and frail. His sons were in their 30s, strong but lost. They had no wives, no friends, no future. The only life they knew was the one buried in the dirt of the Cunningham farm. Silas clung to control, barking orders and rationing food. The sons obeyed, but inside, resentment grew like mold. Nehemiah began whispering to his brothers late at night, planting ideas in their minds. "Father doesn't want us to live," he said. "He keeps us trapped here like dogs." Josiah and Caleb listened, uneasy but loyal. Nehemiah's voice was soft, persuasive. "He's old," he said. "He won't last another winter. Why wait for nature when we can set ourselves free?" Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, the three brothers made a plan. On the night of March 11, 1879, Silas argued with them about food supplies. He accused them of laziness, of disobedience, of being ungrateful. Caleb snapped. He shoved Silas, and the old man fell hard against the table, blood running from his head. Nehemiah's voice cut through the chaos. "He's not dead yet," he said. "But he will be." They carried Silas outside, half-conscious, moaning, confused. The ground behind the root cellar was soft from thawing snow. They dug a shallow pit, wrapped their father in a blanket, and placed him inside. As the earth fell over him, Silas woke and began to scream. Josiah hesitated. "Maybe we should stop," he whispered. Nehemiah glared at him. "If we stop now, he'll kill us come morning." The last shovelful of dirt hit Silas's chest. Then the world went silent. The next morning, the brothers behaved as if nothing had happened. Josiah fed the chickens. Caleb chopped wood. Nehemiah cleaned the kitchen, but none of them went near the root cellar. The ground there seemed to hum with something alive, something that remembered. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Josiah swore he heard muffled sounds from the earth outside, like someone calling his name. To be continued in Part 4, The Voices Beneath the Farm. Would you like me to write Part 4 next in the same eerie, historical tone, about 1,000 words, simple English, for YouTube audience? Title: The Voices Beneath the Farm, Part 4. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. That night, the wind screamed across the Pennsylvania hills. Inside the Cunningham farmhouse, the brothers tried to sleep, but the silence between the gusts was worse than the storm. Josiah awoke first. He sat up, trembling, because he could hear it again, the soft, broken voice rising from beneath the ground behind the root cellar. His father's voice. It was weak but clear, calling his name through the frozen earth. "Josiah, help me." Part 4: The Voices Beneath the Farm. Morning came gray and cold. The brothers gathered around the small kitchen table, their faces pale and sleepless. None of them spoke of what they had heard, but all three knew something was not finished. Josiah stared at his bowl of corn mush without eating. "It was him," he whispered finally. "I heard him last night." Caleb slammed his spoon down. "Stop it. He's dead. You buried him yourself." But Josiah shook his head. "He's calling for me. I heard my name." Nehemiah said nothing at first. He just stared at his brother with a steady, cold look that made Josiah shrink back. "You dreamed it," Nehemiah said quietly. Dreams don't mean anything, but Nehemiah hadn't slept either. He had heard it too. The faint rhythm under the house, like someone moving far below the surface. A muffled whisper that rose when the wind stilled. All that day they worked the farm as if nothing was wrong, but none of them went near the root cellar. The ground there looked strange now, sunken in the middle, as if something beneath had shifted. When night fell again, Josiah couldn't stand it. He took a lantern and stepped outside. The snow crunched under his boots. The air was still. The earth behind the cellar looked freshly disturbed. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the soil. At first there was only silence. Then, from deep below, came the sound. "Josiah, my son, why did you do this?" He dropped the lantern. It shattered, the flame flickering out. Josiah ran back to the house, gasping and shaking. "He's alive. We have to dig him out," he shouted. Caleb and Nehemiah came running. Nehemiah grabbed him by the collar. "You go near that place again and I'll bury you beside him," he said, his voice low and fierce. Caleb looked between them, torn. "Maybe he's right, Nehemiah. Maybe father's not dead." Nehemiah's eyes flashed. "He's dead. He's dead because he was killing us. Do you want him to come back and finish it?" That night, none of them slept. The house groaned in the wind. The shutters banged. From outside, the faintest sound rose through the dirt, scratching. By the next morning, Josiah was gone. Caleb found the front door open, footprints leading toward the cellar. The snow was trampled, the soil disturbed. Josiah's shovel lay beside a half-dug hole. There was no sign of Josiah himself. Nehemiah stared at the ground for a long time. Then he said softly, "He's gone down to join him." Caleb's voice broke. "We have to find him." But Nehemiah only turned back toward the house. "Leave them both. We're free now." Caleb followed, terrified but unable to resist. Inside, Nehemiah built a fire and sat before it, staring into the flames. "Do you hear that?" he whispered after a while. Caleb listened. From somewhere beneath the floorboards came a slow, rhythmic thumping. That night, the smell began. A thick, heavy odor that drifted through the floor, the scent of wet earth and something decaying. The brothers tried to block the cracks with rags, but the smell only grew stronger. Then came the voices. Sometimes it was their father's voice, weak and broken. Other times, it was Josiah. "Cold down here," the voice would whisper. "Can't see the light." Caleb started praying aloud. "Lord, forgive us, we didn't mean." "Stop that," Nehemiah snapped. His face looked hollow, eyes sunken, lips trembling. "There's nothing to forgive. They're gone." But even he began to change. He would sit at the table for hours, listening, nodding slowly as if someone invisible was speaking to him. Sometimes he smiled. Caleb couldn't take it anymore. One afternoon, when Nehemiah was chopping wood, Caleb went out to the cellar with a shovel. The air there was cold and still. He started digging, calling his brother's name. He had only gone down 2 feet when he found something, cloth, damp and heavy. Then, "Pale fingers," he screamed. By the time Nehemiah reached him, Caleb had dropped the shovel and was crawling backward in terror. The hand sticking out of the dirt wasn't Josiah's or Silas's. It was fresh. The nails were short and clean. It was his own handprint pressed deep into the soil, like he had left it there in his sleep. Nehemiah looked down at the mark, then at Caleb. "It's the land," he said. "It remembers us. It's taking back what belongs to it." That night, Caleb locked himself in his room, whispering prayers until morning. But when the sun rose, his bed was empty. The window stood open. Outside, in the yard, the snow was churned up again near the cellar. Only Nehemiah remained. He moved through the house like a ghost. He no longer ate, no longer spoke. Every night he sat by the door, staring toward the cellar, waiting. He could hear them now, 3 voices beneath the frozen ground, whispering his name. "Nehemiah, come down where it's warm." He didn't resist for long. On the 3rd night after Caleb vanished, he opened the cellar door and carried a lantern into the dark. The neighbors found the farm weeks later. The livestock were dead, the fields silent, and the house empty. Near the root cellar, the earth had been freshly turned again. When they dug, they found 4 bodies, Silas, Josiah, Caleb, and Nehemiah, all lying close together, faces twisted as if they had died still trying to speak. The townsfolk said the ground there never grew crops again. Even now, locals claim that if you walk by that land on a still winter night, you can hear muffled voices beneath the frozen soil, whispering names that don't belong to you. To be continued in Part 5, The Neighbor's Discovery. Would you like me to continue with Part 5 next, keeping the same simple and haunting storytelling style for your YouTube series? Title: The Neighbor's Discovery, Part 5. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. It was early April 1879 when the snow began to melt across central Pennsylvania. The rivers swelled, the mud deepened, and with it came a terrible smell from the Cunningham farm. People in Osceola Mills said it was the stench of death riding the spring wind. At first, no one dared go near that lonely property, but soon, curiosity turned to fear when strange lights were seen flickering through the broken windows long after midnight. Something, or someone, was still moving inside the abandoned farmhouse. Part 5: The Neighbor's Discovery. The first man to notice the smell was Wilhelm Hofmeister, the nearest neighbor, living nearly 2 miles away. On April 4th, he was tending to his fence line when the wind shifted. The odor hit him so hard he gagged. It was thick and sour, like rotting meat soaked in damp earth. He told his wife, Anna, that he would ride out the next morning to check on the Cunninghams. They haven't been seen in weeks, she said nervously. Maybe they went to town. Wilhelm shook his head. No horses, no tracks, no smoke from the chimney. They're still there. He saddled his horse and set off the next day. The path to the Cunningham place was muddy and full of thawing snow. When he reached the property, the first thing he saw was silence. The barn door hung open, swinging gently in the cold wind. No animals stirred inside. Chickens lay dead in their pens, half buried in straw. Wilhelm called out, Silas. Caleb. Anyone home? No answer. He tied his horse to a post and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. The front door stood ajar. When he pushed it open, a wave of foul air rushed out, rot, mold, and something worse. Inside, the house was a ruin. The fire in the hearth had long gone cold, dishes were stacked and moldy on the table, and muddy footprints covered the floor. Wilhelm covered his mouth with a handkerchief. God have mercy, he whispered. Then he saw the writing. On the wall above the hearth, scrawled in what looked like soot, or blood, were the words. We are all under the ground. He stumbled back, heart pounding, and hurried out the door. But as he turned toward the yard, something caught his eye near the root cellar, a patch of earth that looked freshly disturbed, darker than the rest, like someone had been digging even after the snow had fallen. He approached slowly. The smell grew stronger. Flies buzzed even in the cold air. There were faint footprints leading to and from the spot, too many to count, pressed deep into the mud. He saw the handle of a shovel still sticking out of the dirt. Wilhelm ran. He didn't stop until he reached the main road, where he met another farmer, Thomas Bell, coming toward him with his wagon. Wilhelm waved him down, breathless and pale. You need to come, he said. Something's wrong at the Cunningham place. By nightfall, 5 men from neighboring farms gathered at the edge of the property, lanterns flickering in the dark. None of them wanted to go first. The house looked haunted, its windows black holes staring at them through the dusk. Finally, Thomas Bell, being the eldest, said, We'll check the ground by the cellar. Whatever's there, it's best we know. They began to dig. The soil was heavy and wet, and the deeper they went, the worse the smell became. Within minutes, one of the men struck something soft. He gagged and stumbled back. The others pulled at the dirt until a pale hand emerged. They uncovered Silas Cunningham first. His eyes were open. His mouth was filled with soil. Beneath him lay Josiah, then Caleb, then Nehemiah, 4 bodies, all tangled together, faces twisted in terror. It looked as though they had clawed at one another even after death. The men dropped their shovels and stepped back. None of them spoke for a long time. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the slow drip of melting snow. Finally, Thomas Bell said, We're going to the sheriff. When they reached the Phillipsburg sheriff's office that night, they brought with them the story of the grave and the smell, the strange writing on the wall, and the fear that something more than murder had happened out there. The sheriff, William Darby, was a practical man. He didn't believe in ghosts, but when he arrived at the Cunningham farm the next morning, even his resolve began to waver. The bodies were still where the men had left them. Darby ordered them removed to the barn, where he could conduct an examination. He noticed that Silas's hands were torn, the skin shredded, as if he had tried to dig his way out. Josiah's face was frozen in a scream. Caleb's body was twisted unnaturally, one arm reaching upward as though he had been clawing for light. Nehemiah's body was different. His face was calm. A faint smile touched his lips. When the sheriff looked around the property, he found strange signs. In the snow near the grave were sets of footprints, 4 distinct patterns, but they overlapped in a way that made no sense. Some prints went toward the house. Others led away, and still others seemed to circle the grave itself, as if someone, or something, had been walking there long after the men had died. Inside the house, Darby studied the words on the wall again, We are all under the ground. He noticed something he hadn't before. Beneath the writing were smaller marks, faint and uneven, like fingers had traced letters into the soot. It looked like someone had tried to write again and again but couldn't finish. The townsfolk gathered outside the fence, whispering and crossing themselves. The cursed bloodline finally ended, someone said. Should have ended long ago. But when the undertaker arrived to collect the bodies, he refused to touch them. There's something wrong here, he muttered. They don't look settled. So the sheriff and the men buried them again, farther from the house, on the edge of the property. They marked the spot with simple wooden crosses. That night, when the sheriff rode home, he looked back once and saw a lantern glowing faintly through the farmhouse window. He stopped his horse, staring. There was no one left alive to light it. Yet the light flickered, moved across the room, and then went out. Over the following weeks, strange things continued. Farmers nearby heard voices calling their names across the fields at night. Horses refused to go near the Cunningham land. Children said they saw figures standing by the cellar after dark, motionless and watching. By summer, the house stood abandoned, its roof collapsing, the windows shattered by storms. Nature began to reclaim the land. But even decades later, no one built there again. Travelers passing through still spoke of a smell that rose from the ground after heavy rain and of whispers that carried through the night air, saying the same thing, over and over. We are all under the ground. To be continued in Part 6, The Sheriff's Secret. Would you like me to continue with Part 6 next in the same eerie, historical horror tone for your YouTube series? Title: The Sheriff's Secret, Part 6. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. The sheriff thought the case of the Cunningham family was over. 4 graves, 4 bodies, a terrible story buried with them. But when the digging stopped, something else began, something he couldn't explain. Within days of sealing that grave, Sheriff Darby started hearing voices from under his own floorboards. And what those voices whispered made him realize the Cunninghams weren't finished yet. Part 6: The Sheriff's Secret. Sheriff William Darby was not an easily frightened man. He had seen his share of violence, miners' fights, winter deaths, even the occasional murder. But the sight of those 4 bodies in the Cunningham grave haunted him. He couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Silas's torn hands, Josiah's screaming face, and Nehemiah's faint smile. The next morning, Darby sat in his office staring at the written report. He had to send it to the county coroner, but he couldn't bring himself to finish it. How could he explain what he had seen? The evidence didn't make sense. The men were buried together, yet signs around the grave suggested they had been moving after death. And then there were the footprints, too many, too tangled, as if something had joined them in the earth. He decided to keep a few details out of the official report. By afternoon, the townspeople were restless. Word of the discovery had spread quickly. Some said the family had made a deal with the devil generations ago. Others whispered that their bloodline carried a curse that finally came to claim them all. That evening, Reverend Samuel Porter came to see the sheriff. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes but a voice that carried weight. "Sheriff," he said softly, "the people are frightened. They're saying the ground on that farm isn't natural. That it breathes." Darby frowned. "Breathes? What does that mean?" The Reverend hesitated. "2 boys were playing near the property this morning. They swear they saw the dirt move. As if something was pushing up from underneath." Darby rubbed his temples. "That's nonsense. The soil's soft from the thaw. Wind, animals, anything could make it shift." The Reverend leaned closer. "I've known you a long time, William. Tell me the truth. When you looked in that grave, did you see anything unusual?" Darby looked away. "You don't want to know what I saw. That night, he dreamed of the Cunninghams. He stood in their yard, the ground soft beneath his boots. The graves were open again, and the 4 figures stood around them, staring up at the moon. Their faces were pale and still, their eyes black pits. Then Nehemiah spoke. "You buried the wrong bodies, Sheriff." Darby woke up sweating. He poured himself whiskey, but his hands shook so badly he spilled half the glass. The clock read 2:37 a.m. He sat in silence, listening to the creaking of the old office floorboards. Then he heard it, soft scratching from beneath the floor. Like fingernails against wood. He froze. The sound came again. Slow, careful. Then a faint voice whispered, "We are all under the ground." Darby leapt to his feet, knocking over the chair. He tore open the floor hatch that led to the storage cellar beneath the office. The lantern light revealed nothing, just old barrels, tools, and dust. No footprints, no disturbance, but the air down there felt colder than it should have been, and he could still hear a low hum, like breath drawn through the walls. The next morning, Darby rode back to the Cunningham property. He needed to see the graves again, to prove to himself they hadn't changed. But when he arrived, something was wrong. The crosses he had placed over the graves were gone. The dirt was disturbed, as though someone had dug into the earth and filled it back again in a hurry. The barn doors were wide open. Inside, the stench was unbearable. And in the dust near the door, he found footprints, bare human feet. 4 sets. He crouched to look closer, heart pounding. The prints led out of the barn toward the edge of the woods. He followed them, gun drawn. The forest was silent except for the crack of his boots on frozen leaves. The tracks disappeared near the creek, where the water had risen from melted snow. Darby knelt by the water's edge and saw something half buried in the mud, a scrap of fabric. He pulled it free. It was a piece of rough cloth, faded brown, the kind used for work shirts. He recognized it immediately. It matched the clothing Silas Cunningham had been wearing when they buried him. The sheriff stared at the cloth for a long time. Then he rode back to town, saying nothing to anyone. That night, he locked himself in his office and pulled out the sealed portion of his report, the pages he had hidden from the coroner. They described strange findings. Nehemiah's faint smile, the movement of the graves, the footprints that made no sense. He had written them down in case someone ever needed to know. But now, he considered burning them. As he reached for the oil lamp, a knock came at the door. He froze. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. He opened the door. No one stood outside. The street was empty, but in the snow, leading away from the steps, were 4 sets of bare footprints. He followed them down the street to the edge of town, where they vanished near the cemetery gates. On the gate itself, written in soot or dried mud, were the same words that had haunted him since that first night: "We are all under the ground." Darby backed away slowly. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. The moon hung low and pale over the town, and for the first time in his life, Sheriff William Darby felt true fear. The next morning, he sent a telegram to the state authorities, asking for help. He never received a reply. 2 days later, he was gone. His horse was found tethered near the river. His coat, hat, and gun were still strapped to the saddle. But there was no sign of him, except for a single line carved into the frozen mud where he'd last stood. It said, "They came for me too." The people of Phillipsburg locked their doors early after that. No one went near the Cunningham land again. The farmhouse stood rotting on the hill, the fields overgrown, the root cellar sinking into the earth. And though the graves were empty when the next sheriff arrived to inspect the site, the ground still moved sometimes, softly, as if breathing. To be continued in Part 7, The Return of the Dead. Would you like me to continue with Part 7 in the same cinematic and suspenseful tone for your YouTube audience? Title: The Return of the Dead, Part 7. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. For months, the town of Phillipsburg stayed quiet. People thought the horror was over when Sheriff Darby disappeared. But they were wrong. When the ground began to shake one cold night in March, and lights were seen glowing from the Cunningham farm again, the townsfolk realized something buried had awakened, and this time, it wasn't staying underground. Part 7: The Return of the Dead. It had been 3 months since Sheriff Darby vanished. Phillipsburg had tried to return to normal life, but the shadow of what happened still hung over the town. The new sheriff, Elias Boone, was a serious man who didn't believe in ghost stories. He told the people that Darby had probably drowned in the river or run off somewhere. "Fear makes fools of men," he often said. But at night, even he locked his doors and kept his rifle close. The Cunningham farm sat on the hill like a scar. No one went near it. The fences had collapsed, the barn roof had caved in, and the once rich soil looked gray and dry. Some said nothing grew there anymore. Children dared each other to run past it, but few ever tried. On a cold March evening, the town's blacksmith, Henry Pike, was working late when he felt a strange tremor under his shop. His tools rattled on the shelves, and the horses in the stable began to panic. He stepped outside and saw a faint red glow in the distance, coming from the direction of the Cunningham land. The next morning, Henry told the townsfolk what he had seen. It was like fire, he said. But not fire. The light moved, almost like it was alive. Elias Boone gathered a small group of men, Henry, the Reverend, and a young deputy named Caleb, to ride out and see for themselves. The group left before sunset, their horses nervous and snorting. As they approached the farm, the air grew heavy and cold. The sky turned gray, and a smell of rot hung in the wind. When they reached the farmhouse, they saw the glow Henry had described. It came from the windows of the old barn, flickering like candlelight. Boone dismounted first. "Stay behind me," he said, holding his lantern high. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, the barn was filled with dust and cobwebs. The glow came from a single lantern sitting on the ground, but it wasn't burning oil. Its glass was filled with something strange, a red mist swirling inside it like smoke trapped in a jar. Reverend Porter stepped closer. "What in God's name is this?" Before anyone could answer, they heard a low sound from beneath the barn floor. It was deep and wet, like something breathing. Then came a voice, faint but clear. "Elias Boone." The men froze. "Who said that?" Boone called out. No one answered, but the voice came again, this time from behind them. "We remember you." Henry's lantern flickered, and in its dim light, they saw the dirt under the barn floor begin to move. Something was pushing up from underneath. Boone pulled his gun. "Back away, now." The floorboards cracked. A pale hand broke through the soil. Then another. Reverend Porter began to pray loudly. The others backed toward the door as four figures rose slowly from the ground, covered in mud, their faces twisted but familiar. It was them, the Cunninghams. Their eyes were black hollows. Their skin was gray, stretched thin over bone. But they stood upright, as if death had never claimed them. Nehemiah, the eldest, stepped forward. "You buried us wrong, Sheriff," he said, his voice like wind through a grave. Boone's hand trembled as he aimed his revolver. "You're dead," he whispered. Nehemiah tilted his head. So was the last sheriff. Boone fired. The bullet struck Nehemiah in the chest, but instead of blood, black dust poured from the wound. The figure didn't fall. He only smiled, that same faint smile Sheriff Darby had written about before he vanished. The men ran for their horses. The air filled with the sound of whispers, thousands of them, rising from the ground. The earth trembled again, harder this time. By the time they reached the road, the barn behind them had collapsed into itself, leaving only a glowing red pit. When they got back to town, Boone locked himself in his office. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Caleb, the young deputy, begged him to tell the people what they saw. "No," Boone said. "If they know, panic will tear this town apart." But word spread anyway. Henry Pike couldn't keep silent. He told the story at the tavern that night, and by morning, everyone in Phillipsburg knew the dead had risen. That evening, a fog rolled in thicker than anyone had ever seen. It covered the streets, the houses, even the church steeple. People claimed they saw shapes moving in it, tall, slow figures walking toward town. Boone stood at his window, lantern in hand, watching the fog creep closer. He thought of the red light in the barn, the voice that spoke his name, the dust that poured like ashes from Nehemiah's chest. Then he heard a sound outside, a knock at the door. 3 knocks. The same pattern Sheriff Darby had heard before he disappeared. Boone stepped back, his heart pounding. The knocking came again, louder. He reached for his gun, but before he could open the door, a voice whispered from the other side. "Sheriff Boone, you're next." The lantern flickered. The flame went out. The town of Phillipsburg woke the next morning to find the sheriff's office empty. His desk was overturned, his gun still on the floor, and his chair lying on its side. But there were footprints, 4 sets of them, leading out the door and straight into the fog. Reverend Porter gathered the people in the church and prayed for protection. But as they bowed their heads, the ground trembled once more, shaking the wooden pews and cracking the floorboards. And from somewhere beneath the church, they heard it, the same voice that had haunted them for months, whispering through the cracks in the floor. "We are all under the ground." The candles went out. The church fell silent. Outside, the fog thickened until the whole town disappeared from sight. To be continued in Part 8, The Night of the Fog. Would you like me to continue with Part 8 in the same cinematic, spine-chilling tone for your YouTube story series? Title: The Night of the Fog, Part 8. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. That night, Phillipsburg disappeared. Every house, every street, every voice vanished under a sea of thick gray fog. By sunrise, no one could see more than a few feet ahead, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of footsteps, soft, dragging footsteps that didn't belong to the living. Part 8: The Night of the Fog. The morning after Sheriff Boone vanished, Phillipsburg was silent. The fog rolled in from the valley before dawn and never lifted. It wasn't like normal fog. It was heavy and alive, wrapping itself around trees and houses like fingers. It carried a strange smell, wet earth mixed with something sour, like decay. No one dared leave their homes. People lit candles and prayed. They whispered to each other through walls and windows, trying to believe the sun would break through soon. But the light never came. Inside the church, Reverend Porter gathered whoever could make it through the fog safely. A dozen townsfolk sat trembling in the pews, farmers, mothers clutching their children, and Henry Pike, the blacksmith, his face pale and hollow. "We are being tested," the Reverend said. "The Lord will not abandon us." Henry shook his head. "This isn't a test. This is punishment. We should have burned that farm years ago." The Reverend tried to calm him, but even his voice trembled. Outside, the fog pressed against the stained glass windows like a living thing. Sometimes it looked as if shapes were moving inside it, tall, twisted shapes that stopped when anyone looked too closely. Then came the first knock. It echoed through the church like thunder, slow and heavy. 3 knocks, just like before. Everyone froze. Henry gripped the edge of the pew. The Reverend raised his lantern and stepped toward the doors. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. Then another 3 knocks, this time louder. The wooden doors shook under the force. The Reverend whispered a prayer and reached for the latch. But before he could open it, a hand appeared against the glass, a gray, dead hand. The people screamed. The Reverend stumbled backward as the hand pressed harder, leaving a dark mark on the window. Then another hand appeared beside it. And another. Soon the entire window was covered in prints. "They're here," Henry whispered. "The Cunninghams." The church bells began to ring by themselves. The sound was deep and broken, echoing across the fog-choked town. Outside, the figures became visible, 4 of them, standing still in the fog, watching the church. Their faces were pale and empty, eyes black as coal. The dead brothers had returned. The Reverend shouted, "Stay inside. Lock the doors." But it was too late. The fog was seeping through the cracks between the doors, spilling across the floor like smoke. It crept up the pews and around the people's feet. Children screamed. Mothers pulled them close. Henry grabbed a burning candle and threw it toward the door. The flame touched the fog, and went out instantly. The air turned colder. From outside came a voice. Calm, familiar. "Reverend Porter," it said. "We've come to finish the prayer." The Reverend dropped his Bible. He knew the voice. It was Nehemiah Cunningham. The doors of the church began to creak open on their own. The fog poured in, thick and cold. Through it stepped the 4 brothers, their clothes torn and wet with soil. Their movements were slow but sure, like men who knew exactly where they were going. The Reverend held up his cross. "In God's name, leave this place." Nehemiah smiled, a terrible, lifeless smile. "God left long ago," he said. "You didn't hear him go." The ground shook beneath their feet. Dust fell from the rafters. From outside, a deep moaning sound rose up, like the earth itself was crying. The people tried to run, but the fog made it impossible to see. Henry swung his hammer wildly, hitting nothing but air. One by one, the candles went out, plunging the church into darkness. In that darkness came the sounds, footsteps dragging, whispers weaving through the air, the faint hum of voices singing an old hymn. The same hymn Martha Cunningham used to hum in her letters decades earlier. Nearer, My God, to thee. When the fog finally cleared near sunrise, the church was empty. Every pew was broken. The reverend's Bible lay open on the altar, its pages torn and wet. The bell in the steeple had cracked straight down the middle. Only one man was found alive, Henry Pike. He was discovered walking barefoot through the fields, eyes wide and unblinking. When the townsfolk stopped him, he didn't speak for hours. Finally, when someone asked what had happened in the church, he whispered, "They took them underground." After that, he never spoke again. By midday, the fog began spreading again, this time beyond Phillipsburg. Farmers from nearby towns saw it rolling through the valleys, covering the trees and blocking out the sun. They smelled the same scent of wet earth and decay. A traveler passing through that night claimed to have seen 4 men walking side by side down the road, their faces pale and strange, their eyes black holes. When he called out to them, they turned their heads in perfect unison. "What do you want?" he asked. One of them stepped forward. "We want what was promised," he said softly. "We want the world to remember." The traveler ran until he reached the next town. By the time anyone returned to Phillipsburg, the place was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The fog had swallowed it whole. Where the streets once were, there was only flat, gray earth. The houses were buried as if they had been underground for centuries. The church steeple poked through the soil like a gravestone. Nothing moved, no sound, no sign of life. Only a single piece of wood was found at the edge of town. It was the church's door, and carved into it were 4 words. "We are not done." As the search party turned back toward home, the fog began to rise again, chasing them down the road like a living thing. One man looked back and swore he saw figures standing in the mist, 4 shadows, side by side, waiting. That night, a cold wind swept through the valley. The people in nearby towns barred their windows and prayed. Because once the fog comes, it never leaves the same way it came. And somewhere beneath the ground, the Cunninghams were still moving. Still watching. Still waiting. To be continued in Part 9, The Buried Town. Would you like me to continue with Part 9 in the same haunting, cinematic style for your YouTube audience? Title: The Buried Town, Part 9. A historical horror story written in simple English for an American audience. When the rescue party reached where Phillipsburg once stood, they expected to find ruins. Instead, they found nothing at all. No buildings, no roads, no sound. Just flat ground that looked freshly turned, like an enormous grave. And from beneath it, something was still breathing. Part 9: The Buried Town. By the second week of March 1879, word spread across central Pennsylvania that Phillipsburg had vanished. Riders from nearby towns swore that the valley where the town once stood was now just a field of gray dirt. People didn't believe it at first, thinking it was just another wild story from the mountain folk. But curiosity turned to fear when the first search party returned, silent, pale, and shaking. They said the land was breathing. A larger expedition was organized. Among them was Dr. Everett Hale, a man known for his rational mind and skepticism of superstition. He led 10 men armed with lanterns, rifles, and shovels. They arrived at dusk. The fog was already gathering again. Where Main Street had once been, the earth was soft, as though it had been freshly dug and then smoothed over. There were no trees, no tracks, not even insects. The silence was so complete that the men began whispering without realizing it. "This ain't right," one of them muttered. "It's like the ground's waiting for us." Dr. Hale knelt and pressed his ear to the soil. He froze. "What is it?" asked a man beside him. "It's moving," Hale said quietly. "The ground is moving." He placed his hand flat, and everyone could feel it then, a slow, rhythmic pulse, like something alive beneath them. The men backed away, their faces pale in the lantern light. They decided to start digging where the church had stood. After an hour of work, they struck something solid. It wasn't stone or wood, it was bone. A massive rib cage, human in shape but far too large. "Stop," Hale said, raising his hand. "Don't dig deeper." But one man didn't listen. He struck his shovel hard into the ground, and the earth groaned. It wasn't the sound of shifting soil, it was a voice, deep and hollow, rising from below. "Leave us. Buried. The men dropped their tools and stumbled back. One of the lanterns fell, shattering. The flame caught on the ground, burning strangely blue before dying out. Hale tried to steady them. "It's gases from underground," he insisted. "Decomposition can create." But he didn't finish, because just then, something reached up from the soil. A hand, gray and wet, with dirt packed under the fingernails. It clutched the edge of a shovel and began pulling itself upward. Another hand followed, then a face, a pale, eyeless thing that looked almost human. The men screamed. They fired their rifles, but the bullets seemed to sink into the figure without stopping it. More hands emerged from the soil around them, dozens of them, clawing at the surface. "Run!" someone yelled. The men fled toward the tree line, their lanterns swinging wildly. But the fog was already spreading again, thick and cold, swallowing the light. Hale tripped and fell, landing hard on his knees. He looked up and saw shapes moving in the mist, 4 tall figures walking together, calm and slow. "The Cunninghams." Nehemiah spoke first, his voice hollow and distant. "You shouldn't have come here, Doctor. This isn't your ground anymore." Hale tried to crawl backward, but the fog wrapped around him like hands. "What do you want?" he gasped. Nehemiah's smile was faint but cruel. "We want peace. The living never let us have it." The figures began to fade into the fog again, their outlines blurring. Hale shouted after them, but his voice echoed strangely, as if it came from underground. The fog thickened until he could see nothing at all. When daylight came, the other men found Hale half buried in the dirt. His eyes were open, his mouth filled with soil. He was still breathing, but only just. When they pulled him free, he began to whisper over and over, "It's all beneath us, they're building a new town under the ground." He died before nightfall. That evening, the remaining men reached a farmhouse 5 miles away. They told their story, but few believed them. Only one farmer, an old man named Tobias Hart, nodded slowly as they spoke. "I told them this land wasn't clean," he said. "The Cunninghams never left. I saw their lights in the valley last week. Lanterns moving in a line, like they were building something down there." The men stared at him in silence. Later that night, as they tried to rest, the sound of distant hammering echoed through the hills, soft, steady, like nails being driven into wood. It went on for hours. By morning, fog covered everything again. The farmhouse windows were coated in a thin layer of mud from the inside. And in the yard, written in the dirt, were words no one dared to read aloud. "The earth remembers." Days passed. Travelers began avoiding the valley altogether. The government sent a team to investigate but found nothing but smooth, empty ground. There was no trace of Phillipsburg ever existing. The old records, the maps, the deeds, all vanished from the county archives. It was as if the town had never been there. Still, some nights, people living miles away swore they could see faint lights under the soil, soft, flickering, like lanterns moving through tunnels. And if you put your ear to the ground, they said you could hear voices. Low, patient voices. Digging, building, praying. The story spread through Pennsylvania. Parents warned their children not to wander into the valleys after dark. Farmers built fences around their fields, whispering prayers before sundown. And every few months, someone would go missing near the edge of the old Phillipsburg road. No body was ever found, just footprints leading into the fog. One woman, years later, said she saw a man standing near the field one night. He looked lost and frightened, his clothes covered in dirt. When she asked his name, he said softly, "Nehemiah." Then he smiled and said, "The ground is soft tonight." When she blinked, he was gone. The valley stayed quiet for decades, but no one built there again. Even the birds avoided it. Locals began calling it the Hollow, a name that stuck for generations. And sometimes, on cold March nights, when the fog rolls down from the mountains, you can still smell the wet earth and hear the faint sound of shovels scraping beneath your feet. Because the Cunninghams are still there. And they're not finished yet. To be continued in Part 10, The Last Descent. Would you like me to write Part 10, the final and most chilling ending of the Cunningham horror, in the same cinematic and simple style for your American YouTube audience? The storm outside mirrored the chaos within. As the church bell tolled for the final time, Margaret stood in the ruins of what once was her sanctuary. The evil she had fought so long to expose was about to face its end, or drag her into the abyss forever. Part 10: The Final Reckoning. The night at the Hayes estate was darker than any before. The flames from the chapel's broken lanterns flickered like dying souls, throwing long shadows across the walls. Margaret Hayes stood trembling in the grand hall, her hands covered in soot and blood, her heart racing. Behind her, the whispering voices of the past seemed to rise again, echoing through the corridors. She could hear them, her family, her friends, and the ones who had perished in silence. The house groaned under the weight of their pain. The air felt heavy, almost alive, as if the very walls were breathing. She turned slowly toward the staircase, where the portrait of her father had once hung. Now, the frame lay shattered on the floor, the canvas burned through the eyes. Father O'Donnell entered quietly through the broken doorway, his robes torn and face pale. "It's time, Margaret," he said softly. "The truth must be revealed tonight." Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I know. But the darkness, it's still here. It doesn't want to die." Together they descended into the cellar. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp stone and decay. At the bottom of the stairs, the old altar stood, a crude table of oak, marked with strange symbols. Candles burned low around it, their flames bending as if pulled by unseen breath. "This is where it began," whispered the priest. "Your father's pact, the ritual that bound this land to his sin." Margaret's voice trembled. "He said it was for protection, for our family." Father O'Donnell shook his head. "It was never protection, it was power, and that power demanded blood." The ground beneath them began to vibrate. From the cracks in the floor, a faint red glow seeped through. The whispers grew louder, hundreds of voices murmuring, crying, calling her name. Margaret clutched her cross and stepped forward. "I won't let you have them anymore," she said, her voice firm. "You took my family, my peace, my soul. It ends now." The glow flared violently, and a shadow rose from the altar, twisting into the shape of her father. His eyes burned like coal, his mouth curling into a wicked smile. "You think you can stop what's already begun?" The shadow sneered. "You are part of me, Margaret. My blood, my curse." Tears streamed down her face. "Then I'll burn with it." She lifted the old lantern, still half full of oil, and hurled it onto the altar. The flames roared up instantly, swallowing the symbols, the candles, and the shadow that screamed in fury. The walls shook as the fire spread, turning the cellar into a blazing inferno. Father O'Donnell pulled her toward the stairs, coughing through the smoke. "Hurry, we must get out." But Margaret stopped halfway. "The voices, they're still trapped," she cried. She broke free from his grasp and turned back. The firelight illuminated the faces that had haunted her, dozens of them, pale and sorrowful, rising within the smoke. For a moment, the whispers softened into something like a sigh. Margaret clasped her hands together and whispered a prayer. "May you all find peace." The light grew brighter, almost blinding. Then there was silence. When Father O'Donnell awoke outside on the wet grass, the house was gone. In its place stood only the stone foundation, smoldering beneath the rain. Margaret was nowhere to be seen. Days later, villagers claimed they saw her walking by the river at dawn, her dress untouched by the fire, her face calm at last. Others said she was buried beneath the chapel ruins, watching over the land she had freed. Years passed, and the Hayes estate was forgotten. But on cold autumn nights, travelers who passed through the valley still spoke of a figure standing by the river, a woman with ash in her hair and a lantern in her hand. And when the wind blew just right, they swore they could hear her whisper, "It ends here." Call to action. If you felt the chill of Margaret Hayes's final stand, don't let her story fade away. Subscribe to the channel for more haunting tales from America's dark past. Like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comments. Your voice keeps these stories alive.